So more violence in France last night. Hundreds were arrested. It was a third night of protests across the country. This following the police killing of a teenager. President Emmanuel Macron left the EU leaders meeting in Brussels. He had to head home. He had to hold crisis talks. This as the government considers declaring a state of emergency. Let's go to Paris now and get a sense of what is happening. Our bureau chief there is Alan Katz. He joins us now with the latest. Alan, we've seen the pictures. Can you just describe the reality of what Paris is like as we work our way through these protests?
Sure. So central Paris is mostly calm. There was one or two stores that were looted last night, but generally this protest, like some that have preceded it, are happening in the suburbs. They happen in the suburbs of Paris and the suburbs of some other cities because these are protests that are in part about economic exclusion and in part about perceptions of racism, particularly in policing. And so the protests happen largely in neighborhoods that are, either majority descendants of immigrants from North Africa or Central Africa. And so it tends to not be very much in central Paris. Now, that said, the protests have become stronger over the 3 nights that they've happened. There have been more people out on the streets. There's been a bigger police response for it. And so it doesn't look like things are declining. Certainly, at least not yet, and I would expect them to go on for several more nights at least. Again, these protests happen mainly at night after dark. So in France, in the summertime, that's roughly from about 11 p.m. to, say, 4 o'clock in the morning. That's when you have the peak of these things.
Put this into perspective. You kind of started to talk about the range of troubles that have brewed, protests earlier in the year for different economic reasons, and now these concerns about racism and about police force. What does this mean for Paris? What does this mean for Macron? What does this mean for the relationship between the people and the government?
So it is quite different. The protests earlier this year were against retirement reform, as you mentioned, and that was a pretty broad-based opposition to increasing the retirement age to 64 from 62. It was mostly calm, and it was not this kind of real anger that you get in France, or you've had riots in Sweden, you've had riots in the U.S. Over racism issues. France is a difficult country to talk about in terms of racism because they refuse to collect a lot of the data that you have, say, in the U.S. or the U.K. And so it's sometimes hard to describe it. But there is, France, like any other multi-ethnic country, has racism, and so the violence that you're seeing right now is really something that's been an issue in France for decades, which is the exclusion of particularly French-born children and grandchildren of immigrants, mainly from North Africa, and how they've been excluded or not from sort of French economic life, largely based on who they are and where they come from.
Alan, how is the right responding to this?
So, as you might expect, they certainly, at least initially, there was a big effort to sort of blame Nael, the teenager who was killed by the police officer, to say that he's a bad kid, he's got a long police record, and that hasn't held up, and the police officer has been charged with murder and is being held in pretrial detention. And so now much more of it is about sort of the violence. This is terrible. There's no justification ever for violence, and the people who are committing violence are attacking the French state and French institutions. And so they're, as usual, they're trying to demonize or find a group to demonize. Demonizing the victim in this case didn't work out very well, so they're looking for other groups.